Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians, and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's conversation circle on LGBTQI in the workplace. I have several association friends joining me today for what will, I'm sure, be a lively and fun and informative conversation. So with that, I'll ask our panelists to real quickly introduce themselves so you're aware of everyone that is on the phone and the video today. And then we're going to spend just a few minutes. We're all just going to start off today by telling you a lot of stories. Because we think that that's the best way to learn is by learning from other people and hearing how we've had our experiences and how those have shaped all of us. So we're real briefly in 2 to 3 minutes going to just share a story about our coming out process and how it helped shape who we are today as association professionals. So without further ado, let's start with Desiree.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Desiree Knight. I am the Director of Education and Meetings for American Railway Engineering Maintenance of a Way Association. I am also a PCMA, Professional Convention Management Association board member, and a chair of the governance committee.
Heather.
Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Pownall, and I am the Chief Development Officer for the Association for Women in Science, where I've been for about a year, and really thrilled to be able to work there with that organization. Prior to that, I was for about 7.5 years with the Association for International Certified Professional Accountants, otherwise known as AICPA, and had some tremendous experiences there, leading global business development. And before that was in startups, renewable energy startup companies. So I have a diverse background coming into associations, and I'm thrilled for the conversation here and all the stories that we get to be part of as part of this welcoming conversation. So great I can't see all of you, but I'm imagining what you look like. So great to be here with everyone.
We're sure everyone has a close. Heather and I, we were part of the same DELP class, and I should mention that that is a thread that ties a lot of us together here today, and you'll hear that through some of the introductions as well as Lane. 3 of us were in the same DELP class, and Dante and Desiree are also part of the DELP program. So Dante, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Dante Shannon. I'm the CEO of the Association for Equipment Management Professionals, also an account executive at AMP Association Management. Been in association management for about 13 years. I'm in my currently in my second CEO role, and have worked for associations both large and small with different cultures, different environments. So I'm happy to contribute my experience to the discussion today.
Thank you, Dante. Lane.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lane Belayo, and I am the CEO and owner of Synergos Association Management Company. We're an association management company with offices in Indianapolis and in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I was also part of Bob's DELP class. I've been actively involved in associations for quite some time, and love the work that I'm able to do with our state, regional, national, and international associations at the AMC. So excited to be here and talk with you all today.
Thank you, Lane. And last but not least, Jim.
Hey there, Jim Zaniello. I run Vetted Solutions, an executive search firm. I appreciate the opportunity not only to be here today, but really appreciate Association Forum for doing this. In all the years I've been in association management, I can't think of any other organization in our space that's given the opportunity for a session like this. So I'm thrilled to see where it all goes today.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, thank you. To let everyone know too, I'm currently serving on Association Forum's board, and just really appreciate Jim and Vetted Solution support over all these years. You've been a true supporter for our community. All right, so let's get things started off with some stories. Who wants to start about their coming out story and how it went, positive, negative, and how it shaped who you are today as an association professional? I'll call on people real quick.
Well, can I just ask the question? I mean, for me, we discussed that we were going to bring this question up, and I don't really know what the coming out story is. You know, in my situation with the associations I've worked with, it's never been this like wave the rainbow flag and hey, we're going to have a mini Pride festival as part of me joining the office. And, you know, like, congratulations to everybody who had that opportunity. I want to honor that. That's fantastic. Maybe it's my personality, but I have found that it has been sort of different situations at different times where we've had the conversation, and sometimes it's a little bit more subtle than others about where that recognition comes from. And, with so many of the associations that we've worked with, it's not necessarily that I sit down with every one of my volunteers and board leaders and have this great personal relationship where we're going to share stories and share family photos or photos of boyfriends or whatever, anything like that. It is those people that I have the closest relationships to. There's either this, we can have those conversations, and I think some of it becomes cultural awareness within the organization, or awareness of your surroundings more than anything else. But what I think that this conversation has brought up is, as leaders, how do we become sort of more vocal supporters of those people, or set the environment so that everybody feels that they can be in a welcoming situation without having to, while being able to do so in their own terms.
I think similar to you, Lane, for me, it wasn't like this big grand, like, hey, this is who I am. It actually, for me, it was an awakening that people actually knew already. And I was kind of living in my own bubble. I luckily worked for a very large association when I first started in association management. And I remember walking to dinner with one of my committee members, and she simply said to me, Dante, are you partnered? And, I just simply said, no, I'm not. And, just kind of left it at that, because I was not someone who wanted to discuss my sexuality or anything personal about me with members. I had just been, trained that way. And she said to me, don't worry, he's coming. And I just I wanted to stop right then and there and be like, what do you mean? And so for me, I had this awakening, but what I also realized is that it wasn't a big deal, right? But luckily, again, I was in a culture and an environment where that was, sort of the norm already. I knew that I had gay members and they were comfortable with their sexuality. I was just not comfortable at the time, revealing that type of thing to my members. But, her saying that to me, I think just gave me permission just to kind of come to the table and be myself, right? And really also be able to exhibit that in my leadership. I think I went on to even start in LGBTQ work group in that association that, worked in the, helped improve patient care or LGBT patient care in the industry. And so, because of that, it really helped me be more authentic in how I approach my work moving forward.
Dante, that's a great story, because I constantly, as we were talking about this question on Friday, I was thinking in my mind, I must have come out a million times already, right? It's that continual conversation based on the group that you're around. But I vividly remember never officially coming out at work, except, trying to do that dance when the social events appear and, who you're going to bring. I also know that each time that I'm part of a board or is a part of a committee, it's that thing of they're talking about their families and their kids. And then, the next thing is, okay, do I share that I have a partner and I've had a partner for quite some time? And then here comes my quantitative data. I always have to add how many years we've been together so that it will seem that it's a real partnership, which I find that kind of interesting. But I just don't recall, and even growing up, recall coming out specifically to any one group, other than I work collaboratively with 4 other organizations, and the business event strategists for those orgs. They were constantly talking about their kids and their husbands. And then finally, just one day, I just blurted out, I have a partner. And she's a girl. and from that moment on, they have been so gracious with, well, how's Jackie doing? And how are you guys handling this whole COVID thing? And, feeling like you're part of a collective family. So it's just interesting, everyone's process, especially dealing with leadership and your supervisor or your coworkers, how you're going to have that conversation.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. Your dynamic personality, I could just see, rainbow going over your head as you said it. And it's like, I am here and I'm proud.
So Desiree, I had hey, I have a partner, and like that whole experience in high school, and was really fortunate to have a group of fellow athletes and student body president, vice president group that was all coming out around the same time. And we didn't realize that we had kind of grown up really good friends and played sports together. I'm really surprising you all with that, I know, but holding down the stereotypes. It wasn't softball, but the process of not, having been, and there were repercussions of that. I mean, there was not, an easy process with any of our families and things like that. But then going to college and being pretty much, not having to really come out. This has already happened for me, everyone I know. And then for me, I was in a set environment with a community that I didn't have to continually do this. I didn't have to continue to come out. So it was quite a shock to me then. And I met my now wife in college, and we've been together since. So 18 years now. The whole process of coming out in the professional world was that was my whoa, like what is this? And it happened in my first job interview when I sat down at the questionnaire fresh out of college. We just moved to North Carolina. We moved states. Really excited, and he asked the first question, so tell me about your family. And I was just like, and how'd you get here from Florida? Why are you in North Carolina? And I was just so taken aback because my very courageous, Leonora, my wife, she had asked me before going to this job interview, what are you going to do? Are you going to talk about me? Are you going to be open? I'm like, I don't want to work somewhere where I have to hide any part of who I am. And as soon as he asked me that question, something happened within me that I still can't quite explain, but I withdrew. And I started talking about my cousins who live in North Carolina, who I hadn't even seen in 10 years. Like, my cousins live here, it was like I went right, running back into the closet, and I was not forthcoming. And I sat in my car and cried after that because I felt I had just betrayed my own courage. And it took me 2 years. I did not go to work for that company, but shortly after I did go work for a PR agency where I was for a couple of years, did not share with anyone. It was, what did you do this weekend? I'd never mentioned Leonora, nothing. I just was always like, oh, nothing. And I wrestled internally with that every single day that I went to work, until one day in a hallway conversation in the stairwell, I had kind of made friends with a coworker, and I shared with her. And that one conversation then gave me the courage to have another conversation like that. And so then my process after that became one conversation at a time, until it eventually just became easier and easier. And however, there were still times, even as recently as in the past few years, where there have been new types of situations that have challenged how easy that is. Being on a plane, traveling around the world, being on a business trip in Malaysia, where two lesbians were caned in the town square for being caught in a car making out, being in China, talking with coworkers who I don't know how they may take that, and they ask me, so you're married? Well, yeah, I am. Oh, what's his name? Oh, Leonora. Not knowing what the stakes might be and being willing to be courageous anyway, that is a difficult choice. And it's something that I think a lot of my colleagues I've worked with hadn't known, that all of us who are part of the LGBTQ plus family, these are things that we wrestle with behind the scenes that maybe extra that we're carrying. So to be able to have this conversation about it here today, I think is just so rich. So thank you for asking the question.
Can I point out one thing though, Heather? You said that you came out high school, right? And your partner, you not married her, but you found her in college. So I was fortunate that my grandmother actually told my mom at 16 that I was gay, my grandmother. So from that point, I thought, oh, it would be easy for me to just tell everybody, but to pinpoint what you were saying about it becomes difficult based on the sphere that you're in, right? I didn't come out again until my late 20s, early 30s, or actually had the conversation with people. So I can totally resonate with what you were saying.
Thank you for that. Jim.
Well, I'm glad I'm going last, because I had this whole anxiety that all of you had this big professional moment where you came out, and I was like, I didn't have that, right? So my story is not too different than some of yours. I was fortunate in my first job that the association's CEO was openly gay and lived with his partner, now husband. Um, our industry partner members tended to be more open about being gay, right? And so at least professionally in my first job, I had experience with and exposure to others because I certainly wasn't out at that point. And, there was a lot going through my mind then trying to figure that all out in terms of how and when I would get comfortable with who I was. It was probably my third job where I knew some of the colleagues who brought me into the organization, and one of whom was openly gay. And I thought, well, I haven't really come out yet, but he's comfortable here. So it means I can certainly be comfortable here, which was great. Because whether I was ready to or not, at least I knew I didn't have to worry about how people would react to who I was. I think for me, I just started talking about it more when I got married 7 years ago. So I'd never say my boyfriend or my partner, but I did pretty naturally get to my husband in conversation. And so, you'll hear that more in a professional setting now than you would have ever heard anything else before. Because I wear a wedding ring, I still get, so tell me about your wife and kids. And I'm like, well, this will be a fun conversation. But early on, some of my team would deflect from me because they knew I wasn't quite ready to say perhaps to a client, oh, well, I'm married, but not to a woman. And so I'd say I'm probably still on some of that journey, to be honest with you.
Thank you all for sharing those stories. I'll briefly share mine as well. I saw one question come in the chat. So before I start, just want to encourage everyone, please remember that the chat function's there. Add a comment, add a question, feel free, we're monitoring that. My first job after grad school was actually at a food processing equipment company. And it was like brown paneling. It was a throwback to years yonder, and I just felt it, and I was seeing someone seriously at that point, and I just didn't feel comfortable at all, being who I was. And I definitely realized I was keeping myself limited in some capacities. And so my first association job was at the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I told myself at that point, I wanted to be more authentic as myself and be out. And I've realized, and it's a theme I think I've heard in several of your stories, is it's a continuum, right? It's not just one and done. Jim, to your point, like it's one seminal moment and it was like that. It's not. It's a continual story that you're constantly having to tell because of assumptions that people make because of a ring that you're wearing or how you're dressed or whatever the context might be. Assumptions are made, and so you're constantly in that position of having to explain or clarify, which, it is what it is. But I was successful, in my first association job, coming out to my association colleagues. And actually, I went even to help chair one of their diversity SIGs internally and help get domestic partnership benefits. And I used AAP's policy statements for members internally and said, we need to walk the walk internally, if we're going to be the supportive of this community externally. So that was part of my professional journey. But then, with each job, I kind of had a goal. And it was actually one of my adult goals was how do I get more comfortable with this? Because it's just never still felt comfortable to me. It's always, it's exhausting, and it's even still tiring, having been out for a long time at this point. But each year and each job, I get better at it. But Jim, there's something that was mentioned earlier, and it relates to a question that came in the queue here. Much like Heather, you said you were going to be honest in your interview, and you kind of you froze. I have been asked, especially my last few jobs, in the interview about that same question. Tell me about your family life. Are you married? Explicitly, I've been asked those, and these have been like search firm related type jobs that I had been on. And I kind of said, what, screw it. I'm going to be myself, and I want to interview them as much as they're going to interview me. And I don't care if this question's illegal, really, because I want to get it on the table. And if I was picking up on a vibe of, I'm not sure culturally if this is going to be a fit for me, I'm like, I want to know now versus getting myself into a situation and learning kind of the hard way. Maybe that's, out and out, because then you're not helping change, cultures within organizations if you're running from it. But the reality is it's a lot of work, and I think that's what everyone's hearing today is, that energy that has to go into that. And is it your job? And we've heard this in some of the conversations about race too. It's exhausting. I've heard that theme, right? That constantly having to explain what to do. And I think the same can be said here. But Jim, I'm curious your thoughts about, interviewing and using that as your moment to come out, so to speak, and the legality, side of it. And it's a really double-edged sword. If you have any thoughts, being a search firm expert.
I'll try and sort of answer it from two perspectives, because when we're conducting searches, a lot of times candidates will ask me, as a gay man or woman, will I be comfortable in this culture, in this environment? And the first couple of times I got the question, I was sort of taken aback because, right, what's the legal response there? And then I thought, well, how amazing that the person who's asking the question is being their authentic selves and really wants to know. And so from that side, I think candidates should always feel free to ask. And if you get an answer that doesn't seem as comfortable to you, that's great data. And similarly, even though the organization shouldn't ask, if they do, and I've certainly seen candidates say, well, you can't ask me that. But you know what, if they do ask, even if it's not right, it's a gift to you, because when you respond as your authentic self, if that's an issue for them, you'd much rather find out or never find out, I think, than to go there and be uncomfortable. It's still challenging, right? But I think the more we can be our authentic selves, it sort of dovetails with one of the questions that just got put up, which is how can organizations give candidates the opportunity to be them true selves? And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that area and no easy advice. But other panelists, how do you feel about the question that was just popped up? Any advice for employers?
When the question came up, I immediately thought, wow, especially because we've been doing some hiring and interviewing lately, and I thought that was probably a good question for me to ask ourselves. How do we and how can we be more obvious in our support to just make sure that they feel completely welcomed when they step into that interview in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's just a mindfulness tip that, hey, for us moving forward, and I wrote a little note, we probably need to find some way in our introduction or to make sure that in our job postings that we are being very prominently just pro-diversity, pro-LGBTQI, et cetera, and just setting the tone as immediately as possible. One of the things that I was going to mention sort of later in part of the questions was that I as an owner have to take responsibility to be more upfront about supporting everything than my natural inclination would be to do, right? And I am naturally, everybody on this panel would probably disagree, but I am naturally close to the best in a lot of situations. And but doing so does not set an appropriate tone for what we do to support our employees, how we reaffirm who they are, and make sure that they're in a welcoming environment. So I think it's a great question to toss back, for me to think about for us to be mindful about the situation that we set.
I think like Jim, it's twofold here when we talk about how to make employees feel safe and candidates feel safe. So one, to me, it all comes down to your culture of your organization or your association. And I think as leaders in that association, you have a responsibility to make sure that, and it's constant work to try to make sure that you're always cultivating the culture of openness and inclusiveness within the organization, and quickly shutting down anything that does not align with that, or rectifying anything that does not align with that. And by doing so, you then can speak to candidates about the culture of the job of your association as well, and just kind of say, here's the type of culture that we encourage everyone to facilitate. And it is a group, contribution, but here at this organization, this is how I describe our culture. And you can talk to any staff person who can verify that as well. And here are some examples in ways that we do that, and we celebrate everyone who's a part of our staff, everyone who's a part of our leadership here in our organization. So I think it comes down to making sure that you're always rectifying and cultivating a culture that is inclusive, so that you can talk about that to other people who might be potential employees as well.
I think those are all really, really great, and I like a ditto on all of those. And there's one other piece of the question that I just want to, maybe it's a nuance, but I think the question was, what can employers do to help the candidates or new employees feel safe to share who they are. I think everything that's just been spoken about is, going to create more of that safety from the outfront policies, from the outfront, sharing of the type of workplace you have, to the culture, as Dante was just speaking about, and really making sure that the employees within the organization who may be interacting with the job candidates are living, embodying the cultural ideals, the aspirations. All of that is wonderful and good. And the second part of the question is, make them feel safe. That's covered. But to share, they may not share, and that's okay. I share this because I worked with a woman once who was really frustrated that she was, felt she was a very open and inclusive manager, and she had hired this man who she perceived was gay, and he would not come out to her, and she took it as a personal. And she's like, I'm trying to create a culture where he feels safe, and I really want him to be able to share this with me, but he won't, open up. And so I just want to reiterate this point here, that it's a very personal journey for some people, that no matter how inclusive and nurturing the culture may be, it may be a process that they're still working through. It's very personal. So don't take it personally, and continue to just keep showing up the way you are, even if you may have a hunch and it's not being confirmed, or they're not quite, in a trusting place. They may be working through something, on their own that has nothing to do with you related to that.
That is a good.
Go ahead, Dante.
No, I was just going to say, Heather, that is a great point in letting that person take the lead, because in the situation with me and my member, and her just automatically assuming that, and saying he, like, it could have been a very bad situation if I was not at a point personally where I was ready to accept that, so that is a very excellent point you made.
We're going to try and get to that a little bit later too. I think that, you have 6 opinions today for those of you listening in, and we're no by means experts, right? These are all our individual stories, and you're hearing people are different journeys, and that makes it more complicated if you're not part of the LGBTQI plus community, right? So how do you read that, magic 8 ball, and where do you jump in? And we know that that's a challenge, and there are some things maybe we look back in our career and we regret maybe how we handled something because we weren't, along our pathway, and someone had the best of intentions, but because of our own personal journey, we maybe lashed out or didn't react in the best way we could have in hindsight. So we're going to try and share some of those for our stories today. But just as we wrap up this, and we're going to move into our next question, just related to the working piece and resumes. And one of the attendees had talked about being recommended to pull parts of their resume out that talked about them working on behalf of an LGBTQI plus organization. And this individual chose not to because it represented who they were. And our conversation today is reaffirming that that was in fact a good thing to do. And again, I think it comes down to the goal here is to be your authentic self, and you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. I can personally say I've been pleasantly surprised, even though I've had anxiety and nervous. I've never had one of those situations where I felt really discriminated against, or I lost out something. It's like I've persevered, and it's usually been infinitely better when it's happened, and to be your authentic self. And John Hockman, for any of you who know him, he's on today's call as a panelist, but he's one of my mentors, and he always said, just be Bob, be your true self. And it's easier said than done, but I always have him in the back of my head through my professional journey trying to do that. And I think that that's another comment that was made by another attendee, where they were saying that Ernst & Young encourages their execs to come out and bring their whole selves to work. And they asked, do you feel comfortable? Do you feel you contribute better as an out, authentic executive? And yes, the answer for me is yes. But it's a journey to get there. It just doesn't happen overnight, and I think that, like I referenced earlier, each step of the journey, I think you get better at it, and I think you feel more approachable. So Lane, to your point, just if you kind of are guarded, and I think it really gets at a bigger question about personal life and work life, right? And some of us as leaders want that line because you don't want to get too into the emotional weeds of your staff where lines are blurred and you lose your ability to be a professional, right? And make some tough decisions or give constructive feedback. And so where do you open yourself up, right? And regardless of whether you're LGBTQI or not, I think that those are all issues that leaders grapple with, how much to be open. But I think that there's finding that sweet spot is really important. So Dante, I've got a question for you. I was wondering if you could talk to us about a surprise moment that you may have experienced throughout your association career, being out.
I think what's been surprising to me is I think in my experience in working with boards and volunteer leaders is just how much it doesn't matter. It really mattered more to me in my mind than it did. And I think that's because I grew up in the South, very religious family, very strict parents, who, being homosexual was just not acceptable in our household. And it's just something that you did not do. And I carried that, I think, with me into my professional life, also thinking like people are going to think the same way, about my sexuality. So it's something that I need to keep close to my chest and not really talk about, make sure that I'm paying attention to my mannerisms, paying attention to how I talk, paying attention to how I'm engaging with people, to downplay it as much as possible. And it's just been surprising to me about, how much it has not mattered for me in my experiences. Even now, I lead a very conservative association, and our member profile is, 45 to 55-year-old white men. That's 95% of our membership. And really what's been reassuring to me is how it is really about the value that I'm bringing to the organization versus more of who I am. I mean, they're still interested in like who I am and, what I do when I'm not working. But, for them, they really do, accept and, really make me feel like I'm a part of the team and a part of the group, and a valuable contributor. And I've had that same consistent experience with any group that I've worked for. So that's really been surprising to me, I think, to my own regard. But again, I know that there may be differing experiences out there.
Yeah, and I can echo with that in my current association too. There's some board members that are in the 65 and over demographic that you just talked about. And I think that's on me where I'll say, I feel bad that I know that I've made some false judgment calls on other people based on the color of their skin, if they're white, or their age, or where they live in their country, or what their political, views might be. And then I'm surprised where they're like, they're coming out, and they're coming out to me like, my son's gay, and oh, my daughter's this, that. Like they're coming out of the woodwork. I'm like, okay, I didn't see that coming at all, and so you just have to, I think, really, as the LGBTQI community, you need to be open also to possibilities and not maybe be so guarded. I think is, one of my learnings on the journey.
Yeah, and there's so much more, that I've learned that connects us than just what my sexuality is, right? I'm a brother, I'm a son, I, do certain things, or we have certain hobbies in common with other people, who are in a completely different age range, different part of the country, like you were saying, Bob, different demographics. I tend to find those commonalities more than just, somebody being interested in my sexuality. So I've also learned like there's so much more that connects us than just me, being a gay man.
Right. One thing I thought would be helpful for today's call is for us to tell a story from a point of view that might not be just common knowledge. So Desiree, I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through a time in your association career where you just felt out of place. And it might have been something that everyone else around you felt totally in place. It was just a natural event or whatever was happening, but your point of view was very much the opposite. And they might not have known that had they not been inside your head. If you could walk us through maybe one of those situations.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about that dreaded company social.
You like to party.
I do like to party. Everybody knows that about me. In my earlier life, when you would say company social, I would get nervous with who in the world am I going to bring to this social with me? Because number one, I can't hold my partner's hand, I can't whisper in her ear, and I'm going to do everything I can avoid to even have a conversation with her, because I just don't need anyone kind of guessing my lifestyle choices. And just like Dante pointed out, I don't know if this is a cultural thing, but being a Black woman, I'm not supposed to be gay. But let's fast forward a few years ago, and everyone knows that I have a partner. Her name is Jacqueline, and she is the love of my life. I've even hired her as a consultant to do some work for me here at my association. But there was one time when we all got together for a holiday social. And my company we go over the top usually, if we can be in person, with creating a social environment and dinner, and then we'd always get tickets to some sort of show. Well, this particular time, instead of having tickets where everybody was sitting together, there was one set of tickets that was split. And so it was determined that I was going to be the individual that was going to sit at sit at those seats that was split. And I didn't put up a fuss because, you know, me being the Black gay girl, I'll just go ahead and just take whatever they tell me to do just to keep peace, right? So the person who put up the fuss that didn't want to sit in the split seat, she actually came with a friend. She didn't come with a partner or a husband or a wife. So it was just assumed that I was going to be the one to sit in those seats. Anyway, there are a couple of things that I learned from that lesson. Number one, when I feel like something's wrong, you better fight for it, because that whole evening, it just left a terrible taste in my mouth. And I just couldn't get over the feeling that someone would separate my partner and I, and that that my union with that individual wasn't as important as a marriage, or even the straight couples that came, even though they weren't married. But the fact that I actually went home with this individual on a daily basis, and we lived together, and we, at that point, we had been together for 8 years. And so one of the other things that I realized was, even though I had been in that long-term relationship, the second thing that I think that we needed to do after that incident was to have some sort of staff sensitive training that would have been sanctioned by leadership. I personally think, and I know this to be true, that emotional intelligence starts at the top. And if I were to have this happen again, I would just completely stand my ground. And then finally, based on some research that I found, which I didn't know this, but it kind of made sense, that there's this whole thing of onlyness when you start at a company, or if you've been at a company for a long time, and you do have this closeted story, so to speak, where you don't want everyone to know your sexual orientation. And so based on statistics, that 58% of women, lesbian women, don't share their stories. They'll just show up at these events, and they might bring a friend, and they might even bring their partner, but you probably wouldn't be able to guess that that's their partner. And then out of that number, 66% of Black lesbians will hold at their heart that they're not going to share that they're gay. And then lo and behold, only 18% of white males feel the same way. I think it's important so that people can be their authentic self and they bring their whole self to their office, is for organizational leadership to understand that we're all different. Just as I mentioned, emotional intelligence is important, and there are 5 key areas to that. But the main areas are empathy and social skills. I think that if someone is a leader, that they should do everything in their power to make sure that their staff feels comfortable and that it is a safe space to come and work. Because after all, don't we spend a lot of time at work? Yeah, so that's my story.
What would you pick as your top 2 or 3 things that you would attribute to being a safe space? We covered a few things at the beginning, but anything else before we wrap up your question? Because I know those are the burning questions that our attendees are having today.
What I consider to be my safe space?
Yeah, I would just like, what would be, if you had to pick, 2 or 3 things, and when you went into an organization, you'd say, yes, I feel that this is a safe space.
That I can actually show up and be myself, and that I can have, I remember when I got my engagement ring from my honey, I went to my executive director and I was like, I'm engaged. That when I presented that to him, white male in his 70s, the fact that he stopped everything he was doing and he gathered staff to have a conversation about that I was engaged and who I was engaged to. Even though I'm still engaged, let's not talk about that. But one day I'm gonna jump the broom. The other thing too is it's all about your village, right? So I have coworkers that I've worked with for years that I can just share my life with. I think it's important when you show up at work that you have some sort of village that's able to hear you and understand you. And then third, I think it's important that diversity is at the forefront. Diversity is broad spectrum, but it should be at the forefront of any organization. And it should be understood.
And what we talked about in other conversation circles, when race is involved, obviously it's a little bit more presentable, right? You can have a sense, that someone has different skin color. But with LGBTQI, it's often the hidden diversity. You'll hear it referred to as where
Right.
you were saying you can show up with a person and it could go as your sister or your friend, right? And it's not
Right.
readily known unless you share your story, right? So
Right.
I think another layer to this conversation is that sometimes it's not overly obvious to folks, even though some of us might think it is, but it's it might not be to others just based upon their background and if they knew of anyone from the LGBTQI community before. It's really comes to those experiences, whether they're in tune with that or not. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Heather, could you share just some tips that you would offer for leaders and colleagues in the association space to help create a welcoming environment for LGBTQI?
Sure, and Desiree started to get into some of those too. I think those were some really great suggestions already shared just in your story that you called forth, Desiree. So in addition, I mean, maybe to echo some of those and that have come up through this before. Yeah, whoever's just saying that they hate that happened at your big event, that's what I'm feeling right now too. I'm feeling from your story. So sending you a virtual hug on that. But as far as what organizations can do and what leaders specifically can do, I think there's maybe 3 ways that I structure that in my mind. There's like the fundamental baseline. Number 1, and Lane had mentioned this earlier, as well as Dante, that the policies that you have in place, I mean, you need to have written down non-discrimination, and it needs to include sexual orientation, gender identity and expression. It needs to include these things. If it doesn't, and most I would imagine many already have that fundamental base covered, but if not, that would be the place to start. And make sure that carries through in all of your policies, like from recruitment to retention and promotion policies. A particular interest area would be around equitable benefits. So some of us have probably experienced needing to be on your significant other's healthcare plan or vice versa, and the extra taxes you're paying. And there's costs when your companies don't have equitable benefits in place. So that would be something to tend to. Parental leave, family leave policies, things like that. But those things and more are covered in maybe the next level that I would think to as a level of commitment that you can make, which is do a holistic audit. There is the Human Rights Campaign has the Corporate Equality Index that over 1,000 organizations have participated in, and that helps you see where you're doing well and where you have opportunities for growth. There may be other similar assessment tools out there if maybe your association isn't big enough to participate in something like that, but check out their resources nonetheless, and look at the Corporate Equality Index and look at the companies who are getting 100 and look at what they're doing. And reach out to HRC, get their tools and their resources, and look at what you can do. But then the third thing that I would suggest is really focus on these inclusive conversations, because I think the fastest way to impact culture is to have open conversations. And don't underestimate the power of inclusive conversations. I'll share a quick example. And don't underestimate the power of what's come up in the chat a couple times, which is being transparent. Whether you are a member of the LGBT community or you are an ally, be open about it. You never know who else you might touch with just sharing. For example, when someone in an HR department for a previous organization I worked for shared that her daughter had just come out to her and she was really struggling with it because she was fine with it, but they were a very strong Catholic family and her husband was really struggling. And I noticed, Sue, you don't look like yourself. Are everything okay? And when she shared that with me, she felt she could share it with me because she knew I'm, someone who's out and open, and she knew I would be a safe person to talk to. So being yourself, bringing your whole self, and it's not that you're waving it at anybody, but it's just simply be you. You become a safe space for someone else. And so these inclusive conversations, these connections between individuals in the workplace become possible. And this could be literally life-changing for people, because there may not be anybody in their personal network or family or local, the close community they would be able to talk to. So these conversations to create culture can happen in that one-on-one way that I was just describing. But another way is you could facilitate something like I did at AICPA when I was there in 2017. I facilitated a town hall panel conversation with 4 LGBT staff, including the chief operating officer, and also and the 5th panelist was an ally, the woman I was just referring to. And we had 150 people, standing room only. Can you still hear me? I just got some kind of sound in my ears. Okay. We had 150 people, standing room only, to come and hear a panel conversation where we shared some statistics like the ones Desiree was just mentioning about how many LGBT people in the workplace don't share because they don't feel safe. They're afraid. Number one reason is like they're afraid they're going to offend their coworkers. And then they're afraid of the risk of potentially not being considered for advancement. They're afraid of the stakes. You know, what could this cost them in their career? So by having 150 people in a room talking about it, it suddenly became something anybody can talk about. And when each person on the panel shared their conversation, there were tears, there was crying, there were people in the back from the executive suite saying, I learned so much from this in my entire career. This is the most I have learned. So the power of these conversations can't be underestimated. And I just want to share 3 more little quick examples to illustrate the power. One woman from that conversation who was on the panel, she's not out in her family. She has come out at work as being part of this panel. And she had not before that been out with her team because she was afraid. And her you know, she felt this divide between her and her team before that event. After this conversation, her coworkers started talking with her more, engaging with her more. She started to thrive. She got promoted. It made a really big difference for her productivity, her team's productivity, the engagement level. Another woman, a trans woman, said, I felt seen by my place of employment. I feel seen for the first time. I feel seen for the first time, and I've been here 3 years. And then another man on the panel, this gets to more of the personal impact that it can have, said, for the first time in my life, I see a successful gay man married to a husband with kids, and I have a role model. I didn't even know that was possible. And so imagine the loyalty of employees who, you know, you're creating this kind of a space for conversations like this. Literally, this is what changes people's minds and hearts. So get those conversations going. That would be my top advice.
Thank you. Those were really great tips. Lane, I'm going to ask you if you've got anything to add, but before that, I want to weave in a comment that we received in the chat. And one of our attendees today said, as a bisexual Latina, I have felt the pressure of how culture affects the pressure of being true to yourself and keeping the peace at home. It's exhausting. And so I just wanted to share that because it's that's true of all of our employees, right? You just don't know what's happening in people's personal lives outside of the office. And, you know, it could just be a lot of different things, trouble with their kids or who knows, their spouse. But this just adds a whole nother layer too. You know, if you're LGBTQI and potentially from a culture that maybe doesn't embrace this community, maybe as other cultures do, that adds a whole nother burden potentially to your plate and stressor when you go at home. If you're not even out at work, maybe you're not out with your family as well. And that can just all, you know, so being out at work gives you one forum to be yourself. That can really relieve some pressure in what is kind of a kettle pot of steam that's building up. And so work does play a really important role in helping provide really a safe space all the way around. And you don't realize the length that it can go to, I think. Desiree, you're nodding your head. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, because there's something Heather said about having a safe space at work that might be their only safe space. So I think we just have to be open-minded and listen and be caring. Just because someone is different doesn't mean that they should be ostracized.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you know, and Bob, you were talking about this earlier, right? Like you're in a work from home environment where there are painters and whatnot going on. It was mentioned earlier, there was a question about, you know, how COVID has an impact. And I think what all of these elements bring up is that mental health awareness is really key right now. We have to, this is one element of how we can support all of our coworkers, colleagues' mental health by setting a supportive tone in whatever journey, whatever situation they're in. So, you know, you could be in a situation, like was mentioned, where you're not in a very supportive home, and we have to be that outlet, even though you're in a work from home environment. And, you know, what are we doing to be mindful about that? What are we doing to be mindful about how we can be out front and be actionable in the tone that we set to provide opportunities for our staff, colleagues, friends, to be that mental health outlet in a situation where they don't feel supported or where they don't feel like they're in a welcoming environment. So, I think those are some really big things that we just have to be very upfront and honest about and be really supporting of. It doesn't mean that they need to come running to you, but they need to know that you have to be an option to welcome them with open arms and be willing to accept them and drop what you're doing to assist them in their journey, or just to assist them in that day to be supported. And I think that that's really important. Heather answered so much of that question that I couldn't even, I was writing down my own notes. I was like, man, I should have just sat through Heather's lecture.
Heather,
But I think the only things that I would add on to Heather's eloquent soliloquy is that, and she mentioned this, I think, be matter of fact in your support. This is not a situation where we need to just say, well, oh yeah, I've always supported that. Well, if nobody knows, then nobody knows. We have to be matter of fact in our support. It can't be one of those situations where you sort of giggle off to the side. It has to just be one of those things where we set the tone and it's matter of fact, and that's what the support is. I think that we have to be honest with where we are in terms of just continuing to learn about so much of the iceberg that make up all of these individuals. And I'll share a story where in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen these quantum leaps in understanding of gender identity and spectrum of sexuality, from asexuality all the way to bisexuality and everything in between, right? And we have to, there are things that I don't think that we fully understand completely, even at this point, and we have to be willing to learn and understand that there are going to be new ways to define our identities, and we have to be open and honest in all of that. And what we say can have a really negative impact when we think that there's just when we think that we're just throwing off a comment, right? And the things that we would think today in that quote unquote alphabet soup of LGBTQI plus, right, did not exist 20 years ago, 10 years ago, in terms of how we defined what that spectrum of sexuality looked like. So we have to be willing to advocate. I think that we have to be willing to invest in all of those things. On the Synergo side, we've invested with Associations North on some diversity and inclusion efforts. We have, even within some of our association clients, we have personal, as a company, have sponsored helping them finding, going through DEIA training and those types of things. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and we have to be open and public about that, because again, that shows and demonstrates that we're not just saying that we're open, supportive, inclusive environment, but that we're actually doing what we can to make strides towards creating the most welcoming, supporting environment possible. And I think that goes to what Heather was saying. Yeah, it needs to show up in policy. It needs to show up in all of those things. People can't just divine what's in your head as, oh yeah, I've always been supportive. Well, unless you actually are upfront and honest and waving the flag on this, then they're not going to know. They can only assume. You can only drop hints for so long before it just becomes tiresome. And we probably, again, not necessarily to my nature, and it's good for me to be mindful of that, but we have to do that to support everybody who works for us, works with us, etc.
The two things you just said made me think of some other tips that might be helpful. And I'm seeing this increasingly on people's emails using their gender pronouns, or even in their Microsoft Teams or what have you. So depending on your organization, if they have policy, if you're in healthcare, I'm seeing definitely in higher education, they seem to be front runners in adapting this, but that is a real visible way to indicate kind of a safe space. But there's even something explicitly as a safe space sticker. And I forgot the organization that distributes them, that organizationally you can have and pass out for people from the LGBTQI community and our allies to put that in your office. But that gets back to Kathy Bell's question about how does COVID impact that? And I think that that's one of those things. So if you did come from a physical office that did have that sticker and you hired new staff, they might not have those visual cues to know that's how it is if you don't have policy. So I think with everything with COVID, we have to be overly intentional and overly communicate things and set those safe spaces to have these conversations, especially when you have new staff that might not know, where to feel things out or put a picture up of their spouse and kind of feel things out. It's totally different in a 100% virtual realm. So I definitely think that there is an impact, Kathy, to your question, with COVID, especially for your new employees that might be starting, because it's just a whole new world to navigate in a virtual realm if you don't have those other traditional opportunities to create that safe space or communicate who you are. And Lane, you had mentioned kind of like throwing out the cues. That kind of gets to my last question. I'll encourage people to submit your final questions here. We've got 5 minutes, but are there any moments where people kind of have regret, looking back, and how they reacted to something? And is it fair to say, throwing out the cues, and it's what I said before, if someone has never had exposure to someone from the LGBTQI community, being devil's advocate, is that fair just to throw out hints, or where is it our role being from the community to actually be our authentic self and to say it the way it is, I'm a gay man. He's in the line.
I don't know. I'll be honest. It would be very tedious for me from a personality standpoint to just walk into the room and be like, ta-da, every single time. It is never going to be who I can. It's just never going to be authentic to me. And I think that it's probably more important for me to be authentic to myself. But as a company owner, I need to set the policies and have the discussions with staff about how we are an opening and welcoming environment. This is where we're putting our money where our mouth is in that type of situation. The other thing that I can do is, and I was going to mention this earlier, is we're an association management company. We have, similar to Dante's company, a wide range of clients with a wide range of cultures. And my responsibility has to be to make sure that I put my employees in a culturally safe environment where, rather than set them up. So, it's sort of tangential to your question, Bob, about is there something that you might have regretted? I don't know that there's anything that, we've been fortunate that we haven't put them in a situation, but I am always very mindful of, and I argue this with myself all the time, right? Like, I need to put them in a culturally safe environment, but at the same time, I want to be able to move these organizations forward towards just understanding and accepting, and where are they at in the spectrum of just understanding, and how can we get them to take small steps forward? So it's a fine balance between all of those things.
Any other final comments on that, or any other point before we wrap up here?
I just want to say I haven't had a situation where I've overreacted, but I've definitely had situations where I've underreacted after hearing comments, and even hearing comments about people in my own demographic. And I definitely regret doing those for this, and it was at the expense of me trying to what I perceive as saving my own career, or not wanting to be in the fray. And I think about those missed opportunities, constantly. And so whenever they happen, I do make sure that I'm communicative, and also and speak up, to make sure people are understanding that what they're saying, are not right. And I think it's especially important right now with how, politically polarized our country is right now. And I know that it takes even more bravery and even more courage right now to be able to create safe spaces and really put your spike in the sand around true inclusion and welcoming environments right now, when there are so many cases on both ends, or people trying to make their case on both ends of why that should not happen. But it's something that we have to continue to make sure that we keep at the forefront and keep important.
Thank you for that. I know we're on the time here. I just wanted to leave everyone with one last thing, and that words do matter. And so in our follow-up materials, we're going to send a link to you, because it can get complicated. And as was referenced earlier, things change, right? And as being from the LGBTQI community, we're having to learn just as much as some of you, if it's not from part of that spectrum that we've been referencing. So, gender pronouns, we had talked about that, some tips about not saying ladies and gentlemen, or something that's gender specific, just having more generic words like esteemed guests. everyone. Being more inclusive and not being so specific with gender is one tip that we would share to those from our community, but also our allies. Instead of homosexual, that's fairly outdated. Gay and lesbian, from a sexual orientation standpoint, is preferred language. Lifestyle and preference are like the two taboo words. To say it's your sexual lifestyle or your sexual preference. No, it's our identity or our orientation. So those are just a few things. You'll see a few others that will come out there in the references that we'll share with you. I know that we have a slide Sarah is going to pull up for some upcoming activities, but I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for being your authentic selves today, and hopefully today's conversation will empower more conversations to happen within the association communities.